There is a man on a horse at the edge of a great empty country, sitting still in the last light of the day, looking out over the mountains and the rivers and the endless rolling grass. And though he has ridden with the same band of outlaws for most of his life, though there is a camp somewhere behind him full of people who call him family, he is, in this moment and in almost every moment, profoundly and quietly alone. His name is Arthur Morgan, and he belongs to a dying world, the last days of the old American West, and his story is one of the saddest and most beautiful ever told in its medium. The story of a hard man with a gentle heart, a killer who longed to be good, a lonely soul surrounded by people who could never quite reach him. Tonight, slowly and softly and in no hurry at all, we are going to wander gently through his story and through the deep loneliness at the heart of it. And we are going to do it calmly and tenderly, because although his tale is a sorrowful one, it is also, in the end, only a story, only light and imagination and make-believe. And there is nothing in any of it that can trouble you here, in the warm and ordinary quiet of your own room. So settle in now, and make yourself comfortable, and pull the blankets up, and if this kind of slow, sad, gentle wander through the story of a beloved character is the sort of thing that helps you fall asleep, you might leave a gentle like before you drift away, and perhaps tell me down in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and then just let all of it go, and let me tell you, softly and slowly, about the loneliness of Arthur Morgan. Let us begin with who he is, this lonely rider, this hard and gentle man at the center of the story. He is an outlaw, a robber, and a killer, a senior member of a band of thieves who roam the frontier, taking what they need and running from the law. And by the time we come to know him, he has lived this life for the better part of 30 years, since he was a boy. He is a big man, broad and weathered, his face lined by hard years and hard weather, his hands scarred, his manner rough, and to look at him you would see only what he appears to be, a dangerous outlaw, a man of violence, a creature of the wild and lawless country he rides through. But that is only the surface, and the whole tragedy of Arthur Morgan lies in the distance between what he appears to be and what he truly is. For beneath the hard and violent exterior, there is a thoughtful, sensitive, deeply lonely soul, a man capable of great tenderness and great kindness, a man who keeps a journal full of gentle sketches and quiet reflections, a man who longs, more than anything, to be good, and who cannot quite believe that he deserves to be. The hardness is a shell, worn over years of loss and violence, and beneath it there is something soft and wounded and achingly human. He belongs, as we said, to a dying world, for his story takes place at the very end of the Old West, in the last year of the old century, when the wild frontier was closing at last, when civilization and law and industry were sweeping across the land, when the age of the outlaw was ending. The great empty spaces were filling up, the railroads were spreading, the towns were growing, the law was tightening its grip, and men like Arthur, men who had lived free and lawless in the wild country, were becoming relics, remnants of a vanishing age, out of place in the world that was coming. He is a man out of time, and he knows it, and this too is part of his loneliness. The band of outlaws he rides with is led by a charismatic dreamer, a man who took Arthur in as a boy and raised him, who preaches a gospel of freedom and loyalty and living outside the corrupt systems of the world. And this band is, in a sense, Arthur's family, the only family he has known for most of his life. There are a dozen or more of them, men and women bound together by their outlaw life and their loyalty to their leader, and they camp together and rob together and protect one another. A rough and ragged family gathered around a campfire at the edge of the world. And yet, and this is the heart of the whole thing, even surrounded by this family, even in the midst of the camp, Arthur Morgan is alone. There is a loneliness in him that the family cannot reach, a solitude at his core that no amount of company can fill, and to understand him is to understand this loneliness, its sources and its depths, the losses that made it, and the walls he built around it. He is a man surrounded by people, and yet profoundly alone, and it is this, the loneliness at the heart of a man who seems to belong, that we are going to wander through tonight, gently and slowly, as the night draws in. It is a sad subject, his loneliness, and yet there is something strangely comforting in it too, something tender, for in his loneliness we recognize our own, and in his longing to be good and to be loved, we recognize the deepest longings of the human heart. His story is sad, but it is not bleak, for it is shot through with kindness and with a hard-won grace, and there are few gentler things to drift towards sleep upon than the story of a lonely man who, at the very end, found a kind of peace. To understand Arthur's loneliness, we must first understand the strange thing that surrounds it, the family that could not quite reach him. For his is not the loneliness of a man with no one at all, but the deeper, stranger loneliness of a man surrounded by people and yet alone. The gang he rides with is a real family, in its way, a gathering of the lost and the outcast, people who had nowhere else to go and who found in one another a kind of belonging, and Arthur is at the very heart of it, one of its most important members, trusted and relied upon, a brother and a son to the people around him. Around the campfire at night there is warmth and laughter and song, the ragged family gathered close against the dark, telling stories, sharing drink, finding in one another a comfort against the hard and lonely life they lead. And Arthur is part of it, sits among them, shares in the warmth, and yet even there, even in the midst of the family, there is a distance in him, a part of him that holds back, that cannot fully join, that watches the warmth from a little way outside it. He belongs and does not belong, is part of the family and yet always somehow apart. This is a particular and painful kind of loneliness, the loneliness of the man who is surrounded by people who love him and yet cannot let himself be reached, and it is Arthur's loneliness. The gang loves him, relies on him, would do anything for him, and yet there is a wall around his heart that none of them can quite get past, a grief he will not share, a tenderness he keeps hidden, a whole inner life that he shows to no one. He gives the family his loyalty and his strength and his protection, but the deepest parts of himself he keeps locked away, alone. Part of this is the nature of the life, for the outlaw life is hard, and it teaches a man to keep his feelings hidden, to show no weakness, to wear a hard face against a hard world, and Arthur has worn that hard face for so long that it has become almost impossible to take off. He has learned to hide his softness, his grief, his longing, behind the mask of the tough and violent outlaw, and the mask has grown into his skin, so that even among the people closest to him, he cannot quite show what he truly feels, cannot quite let them see the lonely, wounded man beneath. And part of it is grief, the losses he carries and will not speak of, for Arthur has lost a great deal in his life, and he carries his losses in silence, alone, sharing them with no one, so that his grief becomes a wall between him and the world. He does not tell the family about the deepest wounds of his heart. He carries them alone, in silence, and this silence, this refusal or inability to share his grief, is one of the deepest sources of his loneliness, the grief that isolates, the sorrow borne alone. There is a particular sadness in watching a man so surrounded by love and yet so unable to receive it, so unable to let himself be reached, and this is the sadness at the heart of Arthur's story. The love is there, all around him, in the rough affection of the gang, in the loyalty of his brothers, in the tenderness of the women of the camp, and Arthur cannot quite let it in, cannot quite believe he deserves it, cannot quite lower the walls he has built around his wounded heart. He is loved and he is alone, and the tragedy is that these two things are true at once. It is this, more than mere solitude, that makes Arthur's loneliness so profound and so moving, for it is not the loneliness of a man with no one, but the loneliness of a man who cannot let anyone in, the loneliness of the wounded heart that has built its walls too high. And it is a loneliness that will only be healed, if it is healed at all, at the very end, when death draws near and Arthur begins, at last, to let the walls come down, to let himself be reached, to let himself, for the first time, be loved. Arthur's loneliness has deep roots, reaching all the way back to his childhood, for he was, from the very beginning, a boy without a real family, and the wound of that early abandonment never quite healed. His mother died when he was very young, too young perhaps to remember her well, so that he grew up without a mother's love, without the tenderness that shapes a child, and this early loss set the pattern for a life marked by absence and grief. He carried the shadow of that lost mother all his life, the ache of a tenderness he never knew. His father was worse than absent, for his father was a petty criminal, a hard and unloving man, a small-time thief who dragged the boy along in his wretched life and gave him little in the way of love or care. And the boy watched, when he was still very young, as his father was taken away by the law, arrested, and not long after his father died, so that by the time Arthur was still only a child, he had lost both his parents, his mother to death, and his father to prison and death, and was left entirely alone in a hard and unforgiving world. Imagine that, a small boy alone in the wild frontier, without mother or father, without family or home, without anyone at all to care for him or protect him, cast adrift in a dangerous world. This is where Arthur began, in abandonment and loss, a lonely child with no one, and it is the first source of the loneliness that would mark his whole life, the early wound of a boy who learned, before he was even grown, that the people you love leave you, that the world is hard and cold, that you are, in the end, alone. And then, into that lonely and abandoned boyhood, came two men who would change everything, who would take the orphaned boy in and give him, for the first time, something like a family. One was a charismatic dreamer, a man of grand ideas and grand speeches, who preached freedom and loyalty and a life lived outside the corrupt world, and the other was an older, wiser, gentler man, a con artist with a good heart, and together these two found the lost boy and took him in and raised him as their own. They became his fathers, these two men, the only fathers he would really know, and they raised him and taught him and shaped him, giving him a home and a family and a purpose, and Arthur loved them with the desperate love of an abandoned child who has, at last, found somewhere to belong. They taught him to ride and to shoot and to survive, taught him the outlaw life, but more than that they gave him a place, a belonging, a family, and for a lonely and abandoned boy, this was everything, the whole world, the thing he had never had and had longed for more than anything. And so Arthur's whole sense of himself, his whole identity, became bound up with these two men and the family they gave him, for they had saved him, had taken him in when he had no one, had given him a life and a home and a purpose. His loyalty to them was total, the fierce and grateful loyalty of the rescued child, and this loyalty would shape his whole life, would keep him bound to the outlaw life long after he might otherwise have left it, would make him give everything, again and again, to the family that had saved him. There is a terrible poignancy in this, in the way the lonely, abandoned boy poured all his longing for family, all his need to belong, into the outlaw gang that took him in. For it means that when that family began, at last, to fall apart, when the fathers who raised him began to fail him, Arthur was losing not just a gang, but the only family he had ever known, the belonging he had built his whole self around. The abandoned boy had found a family, and the deepest tragedy of his story is that he would, in the end, lose it, and be left, once more, alone. There was a woman once, long ago, whom Arthur loved with all his heart, and the loss of her is one of the deepest sources of his loneliness, one of the great sorrows he carries in silence. Her name was Mary, and in his younger days, Arthur loved her and she loved him, and for a time it seemed that he might have a different life, a life of love and ordinary happiness, a life away from the outlaw trail. They were even, in those days, engaged to be married, the outlaw and the woman he loved, and for a brief and shining, while Arthur glimpsed the possibility of a whole other life, a life he might have had. But it could not be, for Arthur was an outlaw, a member of the gang, bound to a life of violence and crime, and Mary's family would not have it, and the life Arthur led could not be reconciled with the life Mary needed, and so the love, for all its depth, could not survive. They parted, Arthur and Mary, the love broken on the hard rock of his outlaw life, and Mary went on to marry another man and to live a different life, while Arthur rode on into the wild country with the gang, carrying the memory of the love he had lost, the life he might have had. The loss of Mary haunts Arthur, for she represents the road not taken, the ordinary happy life he might have lived, the love he might have had, the man he might have been. Every time he thinks of her, he thinks of that other life, the life of a husband and a home and an ordinary love, the life the outlaw trail took from him. And there is a deep grief in that, in the mourning of a life never lived, a happiness never grasped, a love that could not be. She is the ghost of his other life, the reminder of everything he gave up, or lost, or never had. Late in his story, Mary comes back into his life, reaching out to him for help, and their brief reunion is one of the most poignant threads in the whole tale, for the love between them is clearly still there, still alive, and yet it is still impossible, still too late, still broken on the same hard rock. They meet, and the old feeling stirs, and for a moment the possibility of that other life flickers again, and then it is gone, extinguished once more. For Arthur is still an outlaw, still bound to his fate, and now, though he does not yet know it, running out of time. The reunion only deepens the grief, showing him once more the life he cannot have. There is a heartbreaking moment, in some tellings, when Mary asks Arthur to leave the gang and come away with her, to have, at last, the life they lost. And Arthur cannot, or will not, for reasons of loyalty and fate, and the belief that it is too late, that he is too far gone, that he does not deserve such happiness. And so he lets her go again, the love of his life, chooses his doomed loyalty over his own happiness, and the door on that other life closes once more, perhaps for the last time, leaving Arthur alone again with the memory of what might have been. The loss of Mary is, in a way, the loss of Arthur's chance at an ordinary human happiness, at love and home and belonging in the fullest sense, and its absence is one of the great hollows in his lonely life. He might have been a husband, might have known the deep companionship of a shared life, might have escaped his loneliness in the arms of the woman he loved, and instead he rides alone, carrying her memory, mourning the life they might have had, one more grief borne in silence, one more source of the loneliness at his core. And there is a particular sorrow in the fact that Arthur cannot let himself have this happiness, cannot let himself be loved by Mary, for it is the same wall, the same wound, the same conviction that he does not deserve good things, that keeps him from so much. He loves Mary, and he lets her go, and the letting go is not only fate but choice, the choice of a man who cannot believe he deserves happiness, who cannot let himself be loved, and it is this, as much as the outlaw life, that keeps him alone, the wall around his heart that will not let the love in. There is a wound at the very center of Arthur's loneliness, deeper than all the others, a grief so profound that he can barely speak of it, and it concerns a child, a son that Arthur once had and lost. In his younger years, Arthur had a brief relationship with a young woman, a kind and gentle waitress, and out of that relationship came a boy, a son, and for a time Arthur had, without quite meaning to, a small family of his own, a woman and a child, a little life waiting for him away from the outlaw trail. He did not fully commit to them, for he was young and bound to the gang and afraid, perhaps, of the ordinary life, and so he visited them only now and then, brought them money, played at being a father and a partner without quite giving himself to it, keeping this small family, like everything else, at a careful distance. And yet he did love them, in his way, the young woman and the boy, and the visits to them were among the tender spots of his hard life, glimpses of another kind of existence, moments of gentleness in a life of violence. And then, one terrible day, they were gone, both of them, the young woman and the little boy, killed by robbers who came upon their small home and murdered them for the pitiful handful of money they had. Arthur came to find them, and found only their bodies, the woman and the child he had loved, murdered for almost nothing, for a sum so small it makes the loss even more unbearable. And there is no grief in all his story deeper than this, the loss of his son, a little boy killed for a few dollars while Arthur was somewhere else, living his outlaw life. He buried them himself, the young woman and the boy, dug their graves with his own hands and laid them to rest, and then he rode away, carrying a grief so vast and so terrible that he could never afterward speak of it, could never share it, could only bury it deep inside himself, alone. This is the deepest root of his loneliness, this unspeakable grief, the loss of his own child, carried in silence all the years since, shared with no one, a wound so deep that it walled off his heart forever. The guilt of it compounds the grief, for Arthur blames himself, believes that his outlaw life brought the danger that killed them, that if he had been there, if he had been a better man, a present father, they might have lived, and this guilt eats at him, deepens his conviction that he does not deserve good things, that he is not worthy of love or happiness or family. He had a family once, a son, and he lost them, and part of him believes it was his fault, and this belief becomes a wall around his heart, a conviction that he must not let himself love again, must not let himself have such things, for he does not deserve them and cannot bear to lose them again. This is why Arthur keeps everyone at a distance, why he will not let himself be loved, why he cannot let the walls come down, for he loved once, loved a son, and lost him, and the pain of that loss taught him never to love so openly again, never to let himself be so vulnerable, never to risk such a wound a second time. His loneliness is, in part, a defense, a wall built out of grief, a refusal to love again, because loving cost him so much. And there is a terrible logic in it, the logic of a wounded heart protecting itself from further pain by shutting itself away. And there is a profound sadness in the way Arthur carries this grief alone, for grief shared is grief eased, and Arthur shares his with no one, carries it in silence all the years, so that his deepest wound is also his loneliest, born entirely alone. He never speaks of his son, rarely lets anyone glimpse the depth of the sorrow he carries, and this silence, this solitary grief, is perhaps the loneliest thing about him, the great wound at his center that no one else can see or touch or share, the loss he bears entirely alone. It is a heartbreaking thing, the loss of Arthur's son, and it explains so much about him, his loneliness, his walls, his conviction that he does not deserve happiness, his inability to let himself be loved, and to understand it is to understand the whole of him, the gentle wounded man beneath the hard shell, the father who lost his child and never recovered, the lonely soul carrying, in silence, the deepest of all griefs. There is one place where Arthur's hidden inner life comes quietly to the surface, one window into the gentle, thoughtful soul beneath the hard outlaw shell, and it is his journal, the small book he carries with him and fills, in private moments, with sketches and reflections. For Arthur, this rough and violent man, is secretly an artist and a writer of sorts, keeping a journal in which he draws the things he sees, the animals and the landscapes and the people of his world, and writes down his thoughts, his feelings, his reflections on his life and the people around him. The journal reveals a man utterly at odds with his outward appearance, a man of real sensitivity and real thoughtfulness, who notices the beauty of the world, who thinks deeply about the people around him, who wrestles with questions of right and wrong, who feels far more than he ever shows. In the privacy of his journal, Arthur is tender, reflective, even eloquent, a very different man from the gruff outlaw the world sees, and it is here, in these private pages, that his true self, his hidden self, comes quietly to light. There is something deeply poignant in the very existence of the journal, for it means that all this sensitivity, all this thoughtfulness and tenderness and depth exists in Arthur but is shown to no one, poured only into the private pages of a book that no one else reads. The gentle, feeling man that the journal reveals is a man Arthur keeps hidden from everyone, a self he shows to no one, and the journal is where that hidden self lives, in private, alone, unseen by any other eyes. It is, in its way, the loneliest thing about him, this rich inner life shared with no one, this whole tender self poured only into a private book. The sketches in the journal are particularly moving, for they show Arthur's eye for beauty, his attention to the world around him, the way he notices and treasures the small wonders of his dying frontier, the animals and the plants and the landscapes, drawn with real care and real love. This is a man who sees beauty, who is moved by it, who takes the trouble to capture it, and yet who would never speak of such things aloud, never show this side of himself to the rough company he keeps, keeping his love of beauty, like everything tender in him, private and hidden and alone. And the written reflections reveal a man wrestling constantly with the deepest questions, with the rightness or wrongness of his life, with his guilt and his grief, with his longing to be good, with the meaning of it all. A man thinking deeply and feeling deeply and struggling privately with the burdens of his soul. He is far more thoughtful, far more troubled, far more searching than anyone around him knows. And the journal is where this inner struggle plays out, in private, alone, the searching soul of a man who shows the world only a hard and simple face. The journal is, in a sense, Arthur's only true confidant, the only place he can be fully himself, the only ear that hears his real thoughts and feelings. And there is a deep loneliness in that, in a man whose only confidant is a book, whose only outlet is private pages, who can share his true self with no living soul, but only with the silent paper. It is a beautiful thing, the journal, and a terribly sad one, for it reveals both the richness of Arthur's inner life and the completeness of his isolation, the depth of his soul and the loneliness of having no one to share it with. And it makes his loneliness all the more poignant, for it shows us exactly what is being lost, exactly what tenderness and depth and beauty are locked away behind his walls, exactly what a gentle and remarkable soul is hidden inside the lonely outlaw. The journal shows us the man Arthur might have been, the man he is in private, the sensitive and thoughtful and loving soul that his hard life and his high walls keep hidden from the world. And there are few things sadder than that, than a beautiful soul that no one is allowed to see. One of the deepest and most painful strands of Arthur's loneliness is the slow loss of the man who raised him, the gang's charismatic leader, the father figure Arthur loved and trusted above all others. For across the course of the story, this man changes, darkens, unravels, becoming a stranger, and Arthur must watch, helpless, as the father he loved becomes something he can no longer recognize or follow. It is one of the most heartbreaking things a person can experience, the loss of a beloved figure not to death but to change, to corruption, to the slow becoming of something monstrous, and Arthur experiences it in full. The leader had always been a dreamer, a man of grand ideals, preaching freedom and loyalty, and a better way of living. And for most of Arthur's life, these ideals had been the foundation of everything, the light Arthur followed, the faith that gave his outlaw life meaning. But under the pressures of a closing world and a failing cause, and under the poisonous influence of a newcomer who whispers cruelty and paranoia into his ear, the leader begins to change, to abandon his ideals, to grow paranoid and violent and cruel, to make reckless and terrible decisions that get people killed. Arthur watches this transformation with growing horror and growing grief, for the man he loved, the father who saved him, is disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone colder, crueler, more dangerous, someone who no longer seems to care for the family he once led, who sacrifices his people to his own increasingly mad schemes. And there is a terrible loneliness in this, in watching your father become a stranger, in losing your faith in the person you built your whole life around, in seeing the foundation of your existence crumble and rot. The loss is made worse by the death of the other father figure, the wiser, gentler man who had been the voice of reason, the moderating influence, the one who might have held the leader back from his descent. For when he is killed, the last check on the leader's madness is gone, and the descent accelerates, and Arthur is left without the one ally who saw what he saw, who shared his growing doubt, who might have helped him make sense of it all. With that death, Arthur loses not only a beloved father, but his last companion in his dawning horror, and his loneliness deepens further still. And as the leader descends, he turns away from Arthur, the son who had been most loyal, favoring instead the poisonous newcomer, listening to his lies, pushing Arthur to the margins, so that Arthur finds himself losing not only his faith in his father, but his father's love and trust as well. The bond that had been the center of Arthur's life, the relationship he had built himself around, begins to break, the father turning from the son, and Arthur is left more alone than ever, abandoned by the very man who had once saved him from abandonment. There is a profound tragedy in this, in the way the family that had rescued the lonely boy becomes, in the end, the source of his deepest loneliness, in the way the father who saved him becomes the one who abandons him, in the way the belonging he had built his whole self around dissolves into betrayal and loss. Arthur had poured all his longing for family into the gang and its leader, and now he must watch it all come apart, must lose the family and the father and the faith that had given his life meaning, and be left, once more, alone. And the deepest cut of all is that Arthur cannot save the man he loved, cannot pull the leader back from his descent, cannot restore the father he had known, but can only watch, helpless, as the transformation completes itself, as the beloved figure becomes fully the stranger, the monster, the betrayer. There is no lonelier feeling than watching someone you love destroy themselves and being unable to stop it. And this is Arthur's experience. The helpless watching of a beloved father's fall, the grief of a loss that happens slowly before his eyes, that he can do nothing to prevent. It is one of the great sorrows of Arthur's story, this loss of his father figure, and it strikes at the very root of his sense of self, for the leader and the family had been the foundation of his whole identity, and their corruption and collapse leave Arthur unmoored, alone, forced to question everything he had believed, everything he had given his life to. The lonely boy who found a family loses it in the end, watches it rot from within, is abandoned by the father who saved him, and is left, at the last, more profoundly alone than ever, with everything he had believed in falling to ruin around him. Midway through his story, Arthur receives a blow that changes everything, that reframes his whole life and his whole loneliness, for he learns that he is dying. He falls ill, and the illness proves to be a wasting sickness of the lungs, a slow and certain killer, common in that hard age, and in those days, without any cure. And when a doctor tells him the truth, that he has only months to live, that the sickness will slowly consume him, Arthur must face the fact of his own approaching death. There is a terrible loneliness in that, in receiving a death sentence, in knowing that your time is running out, in facing the end alone. The way he catches the sickness is itself a small tragedy of his life, for he contracts it in the course of his outlaw work, roughing up a sick man in the collection of a debt, so that his death sentence comes to him almost as a consequence of his violent life, a kind of grim justice, the harm he did to others returning at last to claim him. There is a bitter poetry in it, that the illness that will kill him comes from his own cruelty, from the outlaw work he has done for so long, so that his mortality is bound up with his guilt, his death a kind of reckoning for his life. Learning that he is dying transforms Arthur, for a man who knows his time is short sees the world differently, sees his own life differently, and Arthur, facing death, begins to reckon with everything. with the man he has been, the harm he has done, the loneliness he has lived, the life he has wasted. The knowledge of his death forces him to confront the truth of his existence, to ask what it has all been for, to wonder whether there is any way to make his remaining time count, any way to leave the world a little better than he found it, any way to redeem, in his final months, the wrongs of his whole life. And there is a profound loneliness in facing death as Arthur faces it, alone, for he tells almost no one of his illness, carries the knowledge of his approaching end largely by himself, just as he has carried all his deepest burdens alone. He walks among the gang knowing he is dying and they do not, carries the weight of his mortality in silence, faces the greatest and most frightening thing a person can face, the end of life, without sharing it, without comfort, without companionship in his fear. It is the loneliest thing of all, to face death alone, and Arthur, true to the pattern of his whole life, faces it largely alone. And yet, paradoxically, it is this death sentence that begins, at last, to change his loneliness, to crack the walls he has built around his heart. For knowing that he is dying, Arthur begins to reckon with what matters, to reach out, to do good, to let himself, in small ways, be reached. Death has a way of stripping away the defenses, of revealing what is truly important, and as Arthur faces his end, he begins to lower the walls he has held up for so long, to let himself feel, to let himself connect, to let himself, at last, begin to be the gentle man the journal always showed him to be. There is a strange grace in this, in the way Arthur's death sentence becomes the doorway to his redemption, in the way facing the end frees him, at last, to live, to reach out, to love, to be the good man he always longed to be. The knowledge that he is dying gives him a kind of freedom, the freedom of a man with nothing left to lose, and with that freedom he begins to do the good he had never let himself do, to become the man he had never let himself be, so that his final months, though shadowed by death, become the truest and most meaningful of his whole life. And so the sickness, which brings the deepest loneliness of all, the loneliness of facing death, becomes also the beginning of the end of his loneliness, the crack in the wall through which, at last, connection and love and grace begin to enter. It is a beautiful and terrible thing that Arthur should have to be dying before he could begin to live, that the approach of death should be what finally frees him to be the man he always was beneath his walls, and there is a deep and moving grace in it, the grace of a redemption that comes, at last, in the shadow of death. In his final months, knowing that he is dying, Arthur begins to do good, to become, at last, the man he always longed to be, and this turn toward goodness in the shadow of death is one of the most beautiful things in his whole story. Freed by his approaching end, unburdened of the future, he begins to reach out to the people around him, to help strangers, to right small wrongs, to leave the world, in whatever small ways he can, a little better than he found it. He gives money to those in need, helps the helpless, protects the weak, does 100 small kindnesses that his hard life had never before allowed. There is something deeply moving in watching this hard and violent man turn, in his final months, toward gentleness and grace, in watching the good soul that the journal always revealed finally come out into the light. He was always, beneath his shell, a good man, a man who longed to be good, and now, with death approaching, he finally lets himself be that man, finally acts on the goodness he had always kept hidden, and the transformation is beautiful to behold, a soul coming home to itself at the very end. His kindnesses in these final months are small and quiet, for the most part, not grand heroic gestures, but small acts of decency, helping a stranger in trouble, giving to those who have less, showing mercy where he might have shown violence. And it is in these small acts that his redemption truly lives. He does not undo the wrongs of his whole life, cannot balance the great weight of his sins, but he does what he can, small good deed by small good deed. And there is a real grace in that, in a man doing what good he can in the time he has left. And in doing good, Arthur begins, at last, to ease his own loneliness, for the goodness reaches out, connects him to others, breaks down the walls he had built around his heart. Each kindness is a reaching out, a lowering of the walls, a letting of others into his life, and slowly, through his good deeds, Arthur begins to be less alone, to connect, to touch and be touched by the lives around him. The redemption is not only a giving but a receiving, a letting in, a healing of the loneliness through the very act of reaching out to others. There is a particular grace in the fact that Arthur's redemption comes not through grand gestures but through small kindnesses, for it suggests that goodness is available to anyone, that even a man who has done great wrong can still do small good, that redemption is not a single dramatic act, but an accumulation of small decencies. Arthur cannot become a saint, cannot erase his past, but he can be kind, can help, can show mercy, and in these small ways he redeems, as much as anyone can, the wrongs of his life, and finds, in the doing, a measure of peace. The redemption is bittersweet, of course, for it comes only at the end, only in the shadow of death, only when Arthur has almost no time left to be the good man he has finally become. There is a sorrow in that, in a redemption that comes too late for Arthur to truly live it, that flowers only as his life is ending, and yet there is also a beauty in it, the beauty of a soul that finds itself at last, that becomes what it always longed to be, even if only for a little while, even if only at the very end. And there is a deep and hopeful truth in Arthur's redemption, the truth that it is never too late to be good, that even at the very end, even in the shadow of death, a person can turn toward the light, can do good, can become the person they always longed to be. Arthur was a killer and a thief, a man who had done great wrong, and yet at the end he became good, became kind, became the gentle soul he had always been beneath his shell. And there is a profound hope in that, the hope that redemption is always possible, that goodness is always within reach, that no one is ever beyond the possibility of grace. Arthur's personal loneliness is mirrored and deepened by a larger loneliness, the loneliness of belonging to a dying world, for the whole way of life he knows is ending, and he is a man out of time, a relic of a vanishing age, with no place in the world that is coming. The Old West, the wild and lawless frontier where men like Arthur lived free, is closing at the very end of the old century, giving way to civilization and law and industry, and Arthur can feel it ending all around him, can feel his whole world slipping away, can feel himself becoming a ghost of a vanishing age. The great empty spaces are filling up, the railroads spreading across the land, the towns growing, the law tightening its grip, and there is less and less room for the free and wild life that Arthur and his kind have always lived. The frontier that had given them their freedom is disappearing, being tamed and settled and civilized, and with it disappears the whole world in which men like Arthur made sense, the whole way of life that gave them their place and their meaning. Arthur watches his world end, and there is a deep loneliness in that, in outliving your own age, in belonging to a world that no longer exists. There is a particular sorrow in being a man out of time, in knowing that the world you belong to is passing, that you have no place in the world that is coming, that you are a remnant, a relic, a ghost of a vanishing age. Arthur feels this keenly, feels himself becoming obsolete, feels the world moving on and leaving him behind, and this larger loneliness, the loneliness of the man out of time, compounds his personal loneliness, so that he is alone not only in himself but in history, a solitary figure at the end of an age, watching his whole world fade away. The dying of the West parallels Arthur's own dying, for as his world is ending, so is he, the sickness in his lungs mirroring the sickness of his whole way of life, both of them fading together, the man and the age passing away as one. There is a deep and mournful poetry in this parallel, in the way Arthur's personal mortality echoes the mortality of his world, both of them relics of a vanishing frontier, both of them fading into history together, and it lends his story a vast and elegiac quality, the sense of a whole world passing away in the passing of one man. Arthur is aware of this, aware that he and his world are ending together, and there is a strange peace in it too, a sense of belonging to something even in its passing, of fading with the world he loved rather than being left behind by it. He is a man of the frontier, and the frontier is dying, and he will die with it, and there is a fittingness in that, a kind of belonging even in the ending, the man and the age going down together into the past, and it lends his death, when it comes, a deeper resonance, the death of a world in the death of a man. There is a beauty in the dying world Arthur inhabits too, for the game gives us a frontier of breathtaking scope and beauty, vast and wild and magnificent, and this beauty makes its passing all the more poignant, the loss of so much wild grandeur to the encroaching civilization. Arthur rides through a world of stunning beauty that is fading even as he moves through it, and there is a deep melancholy in that, in the beauty of a dying world, the magnificence of a frontier in its final days, seen through the eyes of a man who is himself in his final days. And there is a universal truth in Arthur's condition as a man out of time, for we all, in the end, outlive parts of our world, watch the things we knew pass away, feel ourselves becoming relics of a fading age. Arthur's loneliness as a man out of time speaks to something we all feel, the melancholy of change, the sorrow of watching a beloved world pass away, the loneliness of being left behind by time, and it deepens his story, connects it to something universal, the human experience of belonging to a world that is always, slowly, ending. Much of Arthur's story unfolds in solitude, in long rides across a vast and empty country, and this great lonely landscape becomes, in a sense, a mirror of his soul, an outward image of the solitude he carries within. The world he moves through is enormous and largely empty, a wilderness of mountains and rivers and forests and plains, stretching away to the horizon in every direction, and through it, Arthur rides, often alone, a solitary figure in an immense and lonely land, and there is a deep resonance between the emptiness of the country and the emptiness in his heart. There is a particular quality to these long solitary rides, a meditative loneliness, the rider and his horse moving slowly through the vast country, the only living things in sight, the great land rolling away all around, the sky enormous overhead. It is a beautiful loneliness, in its way, the loneliness of the wild open country, and it suits Arthur, this solitary man, this soul that holds itself apart, so that his long lonely rides through the wilderness feel like the truest expression of who he is, a lonely man, alone in a lonely land. The landscape is rendered with such beauty and such scope that it becomes almost a character in itself, a vast and living presence that surrounds Arthur, that holds his solitude, that mirrors his soul. The mountains and the rivers, the forests and the plains, the deserts and the swamps, all of it vast and wild and beautiful, forms the great lonely stage on which Arthur's story plays out, and the beauty of it, the immensity of it, the loneliness of it, all speak to something in Arthur, all reflect the solitude and the longing and the melancholy of his heart. There is a comfort too in this solitude, for Arthur, alone in the wild country, is free of the walls and the masks he must wear among people, free simply to be, to ride, to notice the beauty around him, to be, for a while, at peace. The wilderness offers him a kind of refuge from the difficulties of human connection, a place where he need not perform, need not defend, need not hold himself apart, but can simply exist in the great empty country, alone and at peace. His solitude in the wilderness is not only lonely, but also, in a way, a comfort, a refuge, a place to breathe. And there is the horse, his companion through all these solitary rides, the one steady presence at his side through the long, lonely journeys. And there is a real tenderness in the bond between the lonely man and his horse, the one creature that is always with him, that carries him faithfully through the wild country, that shares his solitude without demanding anything of his guarded heart. In a life of walls and distance, the horse is a simple and uncomplicated companionship, a warm presence at his side, and there is something moving in it, the lonely man and his faithful horse, alone together in the vast country. The great lonely land, then, is more than a setting. It is an expression of Arthur's inner world, a vast and beautiful and melancholy mirror of his solitary soul, and to move through it with him is to feel the shape of his loneliness, its beauty and its sorrow, its refuge and its ache. The immensity of the country, the emptiness of it, the beauty of it, all speak to the immensity and emptiness and beauty of the solitude Arthur carries, so that the land itself becomes a way of understanding him, a landscape of the heart made visible. And there is a deep peace in these solitary rides as an image to carry towards sleep, the lonely rider moving slowly through the vast, beautiful country, the great land rolling away all around, the sky enormous overhead, the faithful horse beneath him, the whole world quiet and wild and still. It is a melancholy peace, but a peace nonetheless, the peace of the open country, of solitude in the wilderness, of a lonely soul at rest in a lonely land. And it is a gentle and beautiful thing to drift towards sleep upon, the solitary rider alone in the great quiet country at the end of the day. As Arthur's story moves toward its end, and as his approaching death begins to soften him, there come a series of quiet encounters with strangers that gently teach him to let his walls come down, to let himself connect, to let himself, at last, begin to be loved. These encounters are among the most moving in the whole story, small moments of grace in which Arthur, the hard and lonely outlaw, is met with kindness, with understanding, with a love he did not expect and can barely accept, and through which he begins, slowly, to heal. There is a particular encounter, near the very end, with a woman of faith, a nun, that has become one of the most beloved moments in the whole story. For in it Arthur, frightened and dying and unsure of the meaning of his life, is met with a simple and profound wisdom. The woman sees his fear, his sorrow, his uncertainty, and she speaks to him gently of faith and of love, telling him, when he confesses that he is afraid, that he should take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act. And this simple counsel reaches something deep in Arthur, offers him a kind of peace, a way to face his end. There is something deeply moving in this encounter, in the way a stranger's kindness reaches the lonely, dying man, in the way a few gentle words of faith and love touch a soul that has held itself apart for so long. Arthur, who has kept his walls up for a lifetime, who has not let himself be reached, is reached here, in this quiet moment, by the kindness of a stranger, and it eases something in him, softens something, offers him, at the very end, a glimpse of grace, a possibility of peace. The kindness of strangers, it turns out, can reach even the loneliest heart. Through these encounters, Arthur begins, at last, to learn to let himself be loved, to let the walls come down, to let others reach him, and this is perhaps the deepest healing of his loneliness, the slow opening of the guarded heart. For Arthur's loneliness, as we have seen, was never really the loneliness of a man with no one, but the loneliness of a man who could not let himself be loved, and now, in his final days, softened by death and touched by the kindness of others, he begins, at last, to let the love in, to lower the walls, to be reached. The people around him too, the members of his family who remain loyal, reach out to him in these final days, offer him their love, their loyalty, their care, and Arthur, for the first time, begins to let himself receive it, to let himself be loved by the family he had always held at a careful distance. The connections he had kept himself from all his life, he begins, at the end, to allow, and there is a deep grace in that, in the lonely man learning, at last, to be loved, in the walls coming down before the end. There is a beautiful and hopeful truth in this, that even the loneliest heart can learn to be loved, that even the highest walls can come down, that even a man who has held himself apart for a lifetime can, in the end, let the love in. Arthur's loneliness was deep and long, built out of a lifetime of loss and grief, and yet at the end it begins to heal, begins to soften, begins to open, and there is a profound hope in that, the hope that no loneliness is permanent, that no wall is too high, that love can reach even the most guarded heart. And it makes the tragedy of his earlier loneliness all the more poignant, for it shows us that he could have been loved all along, that the love was always there, that the walls were his own, and that had he only let them down sooner, he might have known connection and love throughout his life, rather than only at its end. But there is grace even in the lateness of it, in the fact that he learned, at last, before the end, to let himself be loved, and there is something deeply moving in that, in the lonely man finding, in his final days, the connection he had denied himself for so long. As his end draws near, Arthur finds a final purpose, a thing worth giving his last strength to, and it is the saving of another family, the securing for someone else of the ordinary happy life that he himself was denied. Among the gang there is a younger man, a kind of younger brother to Arthur, who has a wife and a young son, and Arthur, seeing that the gang is doomed, that its way of life is ending, that its leader has fallen into madness, decides that he will do everything in his power to get this young family out. to free them from the outlaw life, to give them a chance at an ordinary, honest existence. It is a beautiful and fitting final purpose, for it is, in a sense, the redemption of all Arthur's losses, the securing for another of everything he himself had lost. He had lost his own love and his own son, had been denied the ordinary happy life, and now, at the end, he pours all his strength into giving that life to someone else, into making sure that this young family, at least, gets the chance that he never had, the chance to escape the outlaw trail and live free and ordinary and safe. What he could not have for himself, he gives to them. There is a deep selflessness in this, in a dying man spending his last strength not on himself but on the happiness of others, in Arthur giving everything to save a family that is not even his own, to secure for them a future he will not live to see. He asks nothing for himself, expects nothing, seeks only to get the young family out, to give them their chance, and there is a profound grace in that, in the lonely man's final act being an act of pure selfless love, a giving of everything for the sake of another's happiness. The saving of the young family becomes the meaning of Arthur's final days, the thing that gives his dying purpose, the good that redeems, as much as anything can, the wrongs of his life. He had spent his life taking, robbing, killing, and now, at the end, he gives everything, gives his last strength and finally his life, so that others might live free and happy, and there is a beautiful symmetry in that, in the outlaw's final act being not a taking, but a giving, the greatest giving of all. And there is a particular poignancy in the fact that Arthur is securing for the young son the childhood that Arthur's own son never got to have, giving to this boy the safe and ordinary life that Arthur's own child was denied. It is as if, in saving this family, Arthur is honoring the memory of the son he lost, giving to another child what he could not give to his own. And there is a deep and healing grace in that, in the grieving father ensuring that another child, at least, will grow up safe and loved and free. The effort costs Arthur everything, his last strength, his remaining time, and in the end his life, for the saving of the young family is bound up with his own death, his final sacrifice made so that they might escape. But he gives it gladly, gives everything for their sake, for in their salvation he finds his own redemption, the meaning of his death, the good that makes his life, for all its wrong, worth something in the end. He dies so that they might live, and there is no greater love than that, no deeper meaning, no truer redemption. And in this final purpose, this saving of another family, Arthur's loneliness finds, at last, its resolution. For in giving everything for others, he connects himself to them, binds himself to their fate, becomes part of something larger than his own solitary sorrow. The lonely man, at the end, is lonely no longer, for he has given himself to others, has poured his love into their salvation, has become, in his dying, part of their living, and there is a deep and beautiful peace in that, the peace of a lonely soul that has found, at the very end, its purpose and its connection and its love. And so we come to the end of Arthur's story, to his death, which is one of the most beautiful and moving deaths in all of the medium, a death that gathers up all the threads of his loneliness and his redemption and resolves them into a final, quiet grace. In his last hours, having done everything to save the young family, having given his last strength to get them out, Arthur is left alone, betrayed and abandoned by the leader he had once loved and the poisonous newcomer who had poisoned it all, left to face his end on the cold mountainside, as the sickness and his wounds finally overtake him. There is a terrible loneliness in the manner of his abandonment, for the father figure who had raised him, who had once saved him, walks away and leaves him to die, choosing the traitor over the loyal son, abandoning Arthur at the very end, just as, in a sense, he had been abandoning him for a long time. It is the final betrayal, the last cut, the father leaving the son to die alone on the mountain, and there is no lonelier image than that, the abandoned man left to face his end by the one who should have stayed. And yet, in the way of the story's grace, Arthur does not die in bitterness or despair, but in a kind of peace, for he has done what he set out to do, has saved the young family, has redeemed, as much as he could, the wrongs of his life, has become, at the end, the good man he always longed to be. Weakened and dying, abandoned on the mountainside, he turns his face to the east, and there, as the light comes up over the mountains, as the sun rises on a new day, Arthur Morgan dies, looking at the sunrise, at peace. There is an extraordinary beauty in this final image, the lonely, redeemed man dying as he looks at the sunrise, the light of a new day breaking over the mountains as his own life ends, and it is one of the most moving things in the whole medium, the quiet, peaceful death of a good man who has found, at the very end, his redemption and his peace. The sunrise he dies looking at is a symbol of everything, of the new day the young family will live to see, of the light after the darkness, of the peace that comes at the end, of the grace that meets even the loneliest soul. He dies alone, in one sense, abandoned on the mountainside, and yet he does not die lonely, for he has, at the end, given himself to others, connected himself to their fate, become part of something larger than his own solitary sorrow, and there is a profound resolution in that, in the lonely man's death being, at last, not lonely but full of meaning and love and grace. The loneliness that had marked his whole life is, at the end, dissolved, resolved, healed, in the giving of himself for others and the peace he finds in the sunrise. There is a deep and moving grace in Arthur's death, the grace of a soul that has found itself, that has become good, that has given everything and found, in the giving, its peace. He had lived a hard and lonely and violent life, had done great wrong, had carried great grief, and yet at the end he became good, gave everything, and died at peace, looking at the sunrise, redeemed. And there are few more moving things than that, than the peaceful death of a redeemed soul, than the grace that meets a lonely man at the very end of a hard road. His death gives meaning to his loneliness. In a way, for all the sorrow and the solitude of his life lead, at the last, to this, to a death of peace and grace and meaning, to a redemption earned through suffering, to a soul that found itself in the end. The loneliness was long and deep, but it was not the end of the story, for the end of the story is grace, is peace, is a good man dying redeemed as the sun comes up over the mountains, and it is a beautiful and gentle thing to carry towards sleep, the peaceful death of Arthur Morgan, alone and yet not lonely, at peace at the very end. Arthur Morgan's loneliness has moved millions of people, has become one of the most beloved and most affecting portraits of solitude in all of the medium, and it is worth asking why this lonely outlaw should reach so deeply into so many hearts. Part of it, surely, is the universality of his loneliness, for though his life is far from ordinary, his loneliness is deeply familiar, the loneliness of the guarded heart, of the person who cannot let themselves be loved, of the soul that holds itself apart. And this is a loneliness that many people know from the inside. We recognize Arthur, recognize his walls, his hidden tenderness, his inability to let others reach him, his conviction that he does not deserve good things. For these are the shapes of a loneliness that many of us carry, in our own ways, in our own lives. Arthur's story gives voice to a loneliness we know but rarely speak of, the loneliness of the heart that has been hurt and has built its walls, and in recognizing it in him we feel less alone in it ourselves, comforted by the company of a soul that shares our solitude. Part of it, too, is the tenderness at the heart of him, the gentle, feeling soul beneath the hard shell. For Arthur is not merely lonely, but lonely and good, lonely and tender, lonely and longing to be better. And this combination, the hard exterior and the soft heart, the violence and the tenderness, moves us deeply. We love him because he is so much better than he appears, so much more feeling than he shows, so full of a goodness he can barely let himself express. And there is something deeply affecting in that, in a beautiful soul hidden behind a hard face, in a tender heart locked away behind high walls. And part of it is the redemption, the way Arthur, at the end, becomes the good man he always longed to be, the way his loneliness gives way, at last, to connection and grace. For this offers us hope, the hope that our own loneliness might one day soften, that our own walls might one day come down, that we too might find, in the end, connection and peace. Arthur's redemption is not only his own, it speaks to all of us, offers all of us the hope of grace, the possibility that even the loneliest and most guarded heart can, in the end, learn to be loved. There is a deep comfort in Arthur's story. Then, for all its sorrow, the comfort of recognition, of company in loneliness, of hope for grace. And this is part of why it moves us so, why we return to it, why we love this lonely outlaw so deeply. His loneliness mirrors our own, his tenderness moves us, his redemption gives us hope, and in following his story we feel seen, understood, accompanied, less alone in our own solitude, comforted by the story of a soul that found, at the end, the grace we all long for. And there is a lesson in Arthur's story, gentle and hopeful, about the walls we build and the love we deny ourselves, about the importance of letting others in before it is too late, about the grace that is available even to the most guarded heart. Arthur learned, at the very end, to let himself be loved, and there is a quiet encouragement in that, an invitation to us to lower our own walls sooner, to let the love in while there is still time, to not wait, as Arthur nearly did, until the very end, to allow ourselves the connection we long for. For the deepest tragedy of Arthur's loneliness is that it need not have been so complete, that he was loved all along, that the walls were his own, and the deepest hope of his story is that even those walls could come down, that even his loneliness could heal. And there is a gentle wisdom in that for all of us, the reminder that we are more loved than we know, that our walls are our own, that the connection we long for is often closer than we think, and there are few gentler or more hopeful things to carry towards sleep than that, the quiet knowledge that we are loved, that our loneliness can heal, that grace is always near. It is worth dwelling a little on the people of the gang, the ragged family around Arthur, for his relationships with them, complicated and tender and often lonely, are among the richest parts of his story. There is the younger man he comes to save, the closest thing he has to a brother, with whom his relationship is difficult and prickly, and yet, beneath it all, deeply loving, two hard men who cannot say what they feel, but who would die for each other, and do. There is the fierce widow who joins the gang after losing everything, whose grief mirrors Arthur's own, and who becomes one of his truest companions, a fellow soul who understands loss. There is the quiet, honorable man of the gang, steady and decent, one of the few who never loses his goodness, who becomes for Arthur a kind of moral touchstone, a reminder of the decency Arthur longs for. There are the women of the camp, who cook and mend and hold the family together, who show Arthur a rough tenderness, who see, some of them, the goodness beneath his hard shell. There are the young ones, whom Arthur watches over with a gruff protectiveness, and the old ones, and the whole ragged crowd of the lost and the outcast who make up the family. Arthur's relationships with all of them are marked by that same loneliness we have spoken of, the loneliness of the man who cares deeply but cannot show it, who protects and provides but cannot open his heart, who is at the center of the family and yet always a little apart from it. He loves them in his way, these people, and they love him, and yet the love is always a little held back, a little guarded, a little lonely, for Arthur cannot quite let himself be fully part of them, cannot quite let the walls down even with the family he has known for so long. And yet there is real warmth in these relationships too, real tenderness, real belonging, for all its loneliness. And Arthur's bonds with the people of the gang are among the most precious things in his life. The family that, for all its imperfection, is still a family, still a belonging, still a home. In the rough affection between Arthur and his brothers, in the shared grief with the widow, in the gruff care for the young ones, there is a real love, imperfect and guarded and lonely but real. And it is one of the things that makes his story so moving, this lonely man's imperfect but genuine belonging. There is a particular poignancy in watching these relationships in the light of what is coming, for the family is doomed, the gang is falling apart, and many of these people Arthur loves will be lost, to death or betrayal or the collapse of everything, so that the warmth of the family is shadowed always by its coming end. Arthur loves these people, and he will lose them, one by one, as the family disintegrates, and there is a deep sorrow in that, in the loving of a family that is already, even as we watch, beginning to come apart. And Arthur, at the end, gives everything to save what can be saved of that family, to get the young family out, to secure for at least a few of them a future beyond the coming collapse. And there is a beauty in that, in the lonely man's final gift, being the salvation of the family he could never quite let himself fully belong to. He could not let himself be fully part of them in life, and yet in his death he gives everything for them, saves what he can of them, pours his love into their survival, and there is a grace in that, in the guarded heart giving, at the end, everything. So the gang, the ragged family around Arthur, is both the setting of his loneliness and the object of his deepest love, the belonging he could never quite feel, and the family he dies to save. And to understand his relationships with them is to understand the whole shape of his loneliness, the love that is always a little held back, the belonging that is always a little apart, the guarded heart that gives, at the end, everything. It is a complicated and tender and lonely thing, Arthur's place in his family, and it is one of the truest expressions of who he is. Part of Arthur's loneliness is the weight of guilt he carries, the moral burden of the life he has led. For Arthur is a man who has done terrible things, who has robbed and killed and hurt people, and who, unlike many of those around him, feels the weight of it, knows that it is wrong, carries the guilt of it in his conscience. He is not a man who can do harm without feeling it, and this makes his outlaw life a torment as much as a living, for every wrong he does adds to the weight on his soul, deepens his conviction that he is a bad man, unworthy of love or happiness or grace. There is a particular kind of loneliness in this moral burden, for Arthur carries it largely alone, among people who mostly do not share his scruples, who do their outlaw work without his guilt, so that his conscience sets him apart even from his own family. He feels what they do not feel, questions what they do not question, carries a guilt they do not carry, and this moral solitude, this being alone in his conscience, is one more layer of his loneliness, the loneliness of the one who feels the wrongness of a life the others accept. His work as an enforcer for the gang, collecting debts, intimidating and hurting people, weighs on him especially, for it brings him face to face with the human cost of his life, with the ordinary people he harms, and Arthur, for all his hardness, cannot quite numb himself to their suffering. There is a deep reluctance in him, a growing distaste for the cruelty his life demands, a sense that he is doing wrong, and this awareness, this conscience that will not be silenced, is both his torment and, in a way, his salvation, the seed of the goodness that will flower at the end. For it is precisely because Arthur feels the weight of his wrongs, because he carries the guilt, because his conscience will not let him rest, that he is capable of redemption, that he longs to be good, that he turns, at the end, toward grace. A man who felt no guilt could not be redeemed, for he would see no need. It is Arthur's very burden, his very guilt, his very awareness of his own wrongdoing, that makes his redemption possible, that drives his longing to be better, that opens him, at the end, to grace. There is a deep humanity in Arthur's guilt, in his inability to do wrong without feeling it, in his conscience that will not be silenced, for it reveals the fundamental goodness of the man beneath his hard and violent life. He is a good man trapped in a bad life, a conscience trapped in an outlaw's body, and the tension between his goodness and his life is one of the deepest sources of his suffering, and one of the truest marks of his character, the good soul burdened by the wrongs it cannot help but do. And there is a loneliness in being a good man doing bad things, in being caught between your conscience and your life, in feeling the wrongness of what you do and doing it anyway, for it isolates a man from himself, divides him against himself, leaves him alone with a guilt he cannot escape. Arthur is at war with himself, his goodness against his life, his conscience against his deeds, and this inner division, this being at odds with himself, is one more source of his profound loneliness, the loneliness of the divided soul. At the end, this burden is lifted, or begins to be, as Arthur turns toward goodness, does what he can to atone, gives himself to the saving of others, and finds, in the doing of good, a measure of peace with his own conscience. The guilt that had weighed on him so long begins to ease, as he does what he can to make amends, to leave the world a little better, to give more than he takes, and there is a deep grace in that, in the burdened soul finding, at the end, through goodness, a measure of the peace it had so long been denied. In his final months, as Arthur reckons with his life and turns toward goodness, he comes to know a people whose whole world is ending, a native tribe being driven from their land and their way of life by the same forces of civilization and greed that are ending Arthur's own world, and his encounter with them becomes one of the most moving threads of his redemption. He sees their suffering, the injustice done to them, the loss of their land and their freedom and their future, and he is moved by it, drawn to help, to stand with them against the cruelty that is destroying them. There is a deep resonance between Arthur and this dying people, for they, like him, belong to a world that is passing, are being swept aside by the same forces of civilization and greed, are relics, like Arthur, of a frontier that is closing. He recognizes in their loss a kinship with his own, sees in the ending of their world a mirror of the ending of his, and this recognition draws him to their cause, moves him to help, deepens his sense of the great injustice of the world he lives in. Arthur comes to know their wise old leader, a man who wants only peace for his people, who tries to protect them from the violence closing in, and he comes to see the injustice done to them with terrible clarity, the cruelty of a civilization that takes everything and gives nothing, that destroys a people and calls it progress. And Arthur, in his final months, chooses to stand with them, to help them, to do what he can against the injustice, and it becomes part of his redemption, part of the good he does at the end, the standing with the oppressed against their oppressors. There is a deep sorrow in this thread, in the destruction of a people and a way of life, in the injustice Arthur witnesses and cannot fully prevent, and it adds to the great melancholy of his story, the sense of worlds ending, of beauty and freedom being crushed by greed and power. Arthur sees it all, feels it all, and it deepens his own sorrow, his own sense of the wrongness of the world, even as it moves him to do what good he can, to stand with the suffering, to add his strength to the cause of the oppressed. And there is a beauty in Arthur's choice to help them, in the way this hard and violent outlaw, in his final months, chooses to stand with a suffering people against injustice, to use his strength for good, to add his voice to theirs. It is part of his redemption, part of the good man he becomes at the end, and it reveals the depth of his awakened conscience, his growing unwillingness to stand by while injustice is done, his turning, at the end, toward the side of the good. The thread deepens too, Arthur's sense of loneliness and of belonging to a dying world, for in the fate of this people he sees his own fate, the fate of all who belong to the passing frontier, swept aside by a world that has no place for them. He is not alone in his ending, it turns out, for a whole world is ending with him, a whole people, a whole way of life, and there is a strange comfort in that, even amid the sorrow, the sense of belonging, even in the ending, to something larger than himself. And it is one more mark of the good man Arthur becomes at the end, this standing with the suffering, this care for a people not his own, this willingness to fight for justice in a world full of injustice. The lonely outlaw, in his final months, becomes a man who stands for others, who cares for the oppressed, who does what good he can against the cruelty of the world, and it is a beautiful part of his redemption, the awakening of his conscience to the suffering of others, the turning of his strength, at the end, toward the good. One of the most moving things about Arthur is the way others see the good in him, even when he cannot see it in himself, the way people again and again recognize his kindness, his decency, his fundamental goodness, and tell him so, though he can barely believe them. Across his story, strangers and friends alike see through his hard shell to the good man beneath. Thank him for his kindness, tell him that he is a good man, and there is a deep poignancy in this, in the gap between how others see him and how he sees himself, between the goodness they recognize and the badness he believes. For Arthur does not believe he is good, cannot accept the kindness others see in him, is convinced deep down that he is a bad man, unworthy of love or praise or grace. And so when people tell him he is good, he deflects it, denies it, cannot take it in. His loneliness is bound up with this, with his inability to accept the good that others see in him, to believe himself worthy of love, to let the recognition of his goodness reach him. And there is a deep sadness in that, in a good man who cannot believe he is good, who cannot accept the love his goodness earns. And yet the recognition keeps coming, again and again, from all the people whose lives Arthur touches with his kindness. And slowly, across his final months, it begins, perhaps, to reach him, to soften his conviction of his own badness, to let him believe, a little, that he might be good after all. The accumulated kindnesses he does, and the accumulated gratitude they earn, begin to build in Arthur a new sense of himself, a growing possibility that he is not, after all, beyond redemption, that there is good in him, that he might be worthy, at last, of grace. There is something deeply moving in watching Arthur slowly come to accept the good in himself, to let the recognition reach him, to believe, at the end, that his life might have meant something, that he might have been, for all his wrongs, a good man after all. It is a slow and hard-won acceptance, a gradual softening of a lifetime's conviction of his own worthlessness, and it is part of his redemption, part of the healing of his loneliness, the coming to believe, at last, that he is worthy of the love others have always seen he deserves. And there is a lesson in this for all of us, in Arthur's difficulty in accepting the good others see in him. For many of us share it, this inability to believe in our own goodness, to accept the love we are given, to see ourselves as others more kindly see us. Arthur's struggle to believe in his own worth is a deeply human one, and his slow coming to accept it, at the end, offers a gentle hope, the hope that we too might learn to see the good in ourselves, to accept the love we are given, to believe in our own worth. For the truth, in Arthur's story as in life, is that he was good all along, that the goodness others saw in him was real, that his conviction of his own badness was a lie his grief and guilt told him, and the tragedy is that he could not, for so long, believe it. The good was always there, always recognized by others, always denied by himself, and the grace of his story is that, at the end, he begins, at last, to believe it, to accept the goodness that was always in him, to see himself, for the first time, as worthy of love. And there is a deep comfort in that, in the recognition that we are, so often, better than we believe ourselves to be, more loved than we know, more worthy than we can accept, that the harsh judgments we make of ourselves are so often lies, that there is good in us that others see even when we cannot. Arthur was a good man who could not believe he was good, and he learned, at the end, to believe it, and there are few gentler or more hopeful things to carry towards sleep than that, the quiet truth that we are, all of us, more good and more loved and more worthy than we know. As death draws near, Arthur begins to wrestle with the deepest questions, the questions of faith and meaning, and what comes after, and this spiritual searching, undertaken largely alone, is one of the most moving aspects of his final months. He is not a religious man, Arthur, has lived a life far from faith, and yet as his end approaches he cannot help but wonder, cannot help but ask what it has all meant, whether there is anything beyond this life, whether a man like him can hope for any grace, any forgiveness, any peace beyond the grave. He is afraid as death nears, afraid of dying, afraid of what comes after, afraid that his life has meant nothing, that his wrongs cannot be forgiven, that he faces the end alone and unredeemed. And this fear, this uncertainty, this searching for meaning in the face of death, is one of the loneliest of all his experiences. For these are questions each person must face alone, questions that reach to the very core of the soul, and Arthur faces them, as he has faced everything, largely by himself, in the solitude of his own frightened heart. It is into this searching that the kindness of the woman of faith falls, her gentle counsel to take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act, and it reaches Arthur precisely because he is searching, because he is afraid, because he is asking the deepest questions. Her words offer him not certainty but a way forward, not answers but a path, the path of love, the gamble that love is real and worth acting on. And Arthur, in his final days, takes that gamble, does the loving acts, gives himself to others, and finds, in the loving, a kind of faith, a kind of peace, a kind of answer. There is a beautiful humility in Arthur's spiritual searching, in the way this hard man, at the end, opens himself to the deepest questions, admits his fear, seeks for meaning, reaches, tentatively, toward grace. He does not find easy answers, does not suddenly become a man of certain faith, but he finds something, a way to face his end, a peace that comes not from certainty but from love, from the giving of himself, from the gamble that love exists and is worth everything. And there is a deep grace in that, in the finding of peace not through certainty but through love. And Arthur's death, when it comes, suggests that he has found this peace, for he dies not in terror, but in a kind of calm, looking at the sunrise, having done his loving acts, having given himself for others, having taken the gamble that love exists, and found, in the taking, his peace. Whatever awaits him beyond the grave, whatever the answers to his questions, Arthur faces his end having loved, having given, having done what good he could. And this, it seems, is enough, is the peace he sought, the meaning he found, the grace that met him at the end. There is a gentle wisdom in this, in the suggestion that peace comes not from certainty about the great questions, but from love, from the giving of oneself, from the doing of good, that the way to face death is not to have all the answers, but to have loved. Arthur found no certain faith, no sure answers, and yet he found peace through love, through giving, through the gamble that love is real. And there is a deep comfort in that, in the idea that we too might find peace not through certainty but through love, that the way through our own fears is the way of love. And it is a beautiful and hopeful note in Arthur's story, this finding of peace through love in the face of death, this quiet grace that meets the searching, frightened soul. And it is a gentle thing to carry towards sleep, the thought of the lonely man finding, at the end, through love, the peace he sought, facing his death not in terror but in calm, looking at the sunrise, at peace at last. It suggests that love is the answer, in the end, to all our deepest fears, and there are few more comforting thoughts than that to carry down into the quiet of the night. There is one companion who is always at Arthur's side through all his lonely rides, one faithful presence that shares his solitude without ever demanding anything of his guarded heart. And it is his horse, and the bond between the lonely man and his horse is one of the quietest and most tender things in his whole story. Through all the long rides across the vast country, through all the dangers and the sorrows, the horse is there, carrying Arthur faithfully, a warm and steady presence at his side, the one companion that never fails him, never betrays him, never asks him to be anything other than what he is. There is a simplicity in the bond between the man and his horse that is precious precisely because Arthur's human relationships are so complicated, so guarded, so lonely. With the horse there are no walls to maintain, no masks to wear, no grief to hide, only a simple and uncomplicated companionship, a warm creature that trusts him and carries him and stays with him, asking nothing but care and offering steady, faithful presence. In a life of lonely, guarded human bonds, the bond with the horse is a rare and simple comfort. Arthur cares for the horse tenderly, feeds it and grooms it and speaks to it gently, and there is a real love in this care, the love of a lonely man for the one creature that is always with him, that shares his solitude, that asks nothing of his guarded heart. In caring for the horse, Arthur can express a tenderness he cannot easily show to people, can let his gentleness out, can love simply and openly in a way his human relationships rarely allow. And there is something deeply moving in that, in the lonely man's tenderness finding its freest expression in the care of his faithful horse. Through all the story, the horse is Arthur's constant companion, the one presence that is always there, and the bond between them deepens across the miles and the years into a real and tender love, the love of a man and the animal that carries him through his life. And there is a particular poignancy in this bond as Arthur nears his end, for the horse remains with him faithfully to the last, carrying him through his final days, a steady and loving presence even as everything else falls away, the one companion that stays. There is a heartbreaking moment in some tellings near the very end when Arthur must part from his horse, when the faithful companion that has carried him through everything can go no further, and the parting of the man and the horse is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the whole story, the loss of the last faithful companion, the final solitude. To lose the horse, at the end, is to lose the last steady presence, the last uncomplicated love, and there is a deep sorrow in that, in the lonely man losing, at the last, even his faithful horse. And yet the bond between them, for all its ending in loss, is one of the warmest and most tender things in Arthur's story, a simple and faithful love in a life of complicated and guarded ones, a warm presence in a lonely life, and it is a beautiful thing to remember, the lonely man and his faithful horse, alone together across the vast country, bound by a simple and tender love. In the horse, Arthur had one companion that never failed him, one love that asked nothing, one faithful presence through all his lonely years. It is a gentle thing to carry towards sleep, the image of the man and his horse alone in the great country, the faithful animal carrying the lonely rider through the beautiful land, the simple warm bond between them. And it is a reminder too of the tenderness in Arthur, the love he could give when the walls were down, the gentleness that his hard life so rarely let him show. In the care of his horse, Arthur was tender, was loving, was gentle, and it is a beautiful and soothing image, the lonely man and his faithful horse, bound by a simple love, riding together through the vast and quiet country. There is a figure in Arthur's story who serves as his dark mirror, the shadow of everything Arthur might have become but refused to, a cruel and soulless outlaw who represents the outlaw life, stripped of all conscience and all goodness. This man is a newcomer to the gang, a manipulator and a snake, cruel without remorse, violent without conscience, an outlaw who takes and kills and betrays without any of the guilt or the goodness that torment Arthur. And it is he who whispers poison into the leader's ear, who drives the gang's descent, who betrays them all in the end. He is everything Arthur is not, this man, an outlaw with no soul, a killer with no conscience, a taker with no guilt, and in him we see what Arthur might have become had he not had, beneath his hard shell, his conscience, his goodness, his longing to be better. Where Arthur feels the weight of his wrongs, this man feels nothing. Where Arthur longs to be good, this man has no such longing. Where Arthur, at the end, turns toward grace, this man remains, to the last, a creature of pure selfishness and cruelty. He is the shadow, the dark possibility, the outlaw with no redemption. The contrast between them illuminates Arthur's goodness, for it is against this soulless figure that Arthur's conscience and his longing and his redemption stand out most clearly, showing us that the outlaw life need not have destroyed Arthur's soul, that his goodness was a choice, a refusal, a keeping of his humanity against everything that might have taken it. Arthur lived the same hard life as this man, and yet where the other became soulless, Arthur kept his soul, kept his conscience, kept his longing to be good, and this keeping, against all the pressures of his life, is one of the truest marks of his character. There is a loneliness in this too, for Arthur, with his conscience and his goodness, is alone against the soulless cruelty of the shadow figure, sees through him where others do not, opposes him where others follow, stands, in his goodness, against the darkness the other represents. And the tragedy is that Arthur cannot stop him, cannot prevent the poison from spreading, cannot save the leader or the gang from the shadow's corruption, but can only watch and oppose and finally suffer the betrayal that the shadow brings. His goodness sets him against the darkness, but it cannot defeat it, and there is a loneliness in that, in standing alone for the good against a darkness one cannot stop. And it is the shadow figure who, in the end, brings about Arthur's death, betraying the gang, siding with the corrupted leader, leaving Arthur to die on the mountainside, so that the dark mirror of what Arthur might have become is also the instrument of his end. There is a terrible fittingness in that, in the soulless outlaw destroying the one with a soul, in the darkness claiming, at the last, the man who refused it, and yet even in his death, Arthur triumphs over the shadow, for he dies having kept his goodness, having done his redemption, having become the good man the other could never be. For the deepest victory of Arthur's story is not survival, which he does not achieve, but the keeping of his soul, the refusal to become the soulless thing the shadow represents, the choosing, against everything, of goodness over cruelty, of conscience over its absence, of redemption over damnation. Arthur dies, and the shadow lives, and yet Arthur is the victor, for he dies good, dies redeemed, dies having kept the soul the other threw away. And there is a deep truth in that the real victory is not in surviving, but in keeping one's goodness, one's soul, one's humanity, against everything that would take it. And there is a lesson in the contrast for all of us, in the difference between the man who keeps his soul and the man who loses it, in the choice, always available, between conscience and its absence, between goodness and cruelty, between redemption and damnation. Arthur shows us that even in the hardest life, even under the greatest pressures, the keeping of one's soul is possible, that goodness is a choice we can always make, and there is a deep hope in that, the hope that we too, whatever our circumstances, can keep our souls, can choose the good, can refuse the darkness, can be, like Arthur, redeemed. Let us picture Arthur now, quietly, at peace, the way you might hold a gentle scene in your mind as sleep draws near, not in his grief or his violence or his loneliness, but in one of his rare moments of quiet contentment. Picture him at his camp in the evening, the fire burning low, the great country dark and quiet all around, the stars coming out overhead, his faithful horse resting nearby. He has his journal open on his knee, and he is sketching something he saw that day, a bird, a deer, a mountain, drawing it with care in the firelight. And for a moment the walls are down, the grief is quiet, and he is simply himself, a thoughtful man at peace in the wild country. Picture the quiet of it, the crackle of the fire, the vast dark land, the enormous sky full of stars, the lonely man at peace for a moment in the great beautiful country he loves. There is no danger near, no violence, no grief pressing, only the quiet of the evening, the warmth of the fire, the beauty of the wild night, and Arthur at rest in the midst of it, drawing in his journal, at peace. It is a rare and precious moment, the lonely man at rest, and it is a beautiful thing to hold as sleep draws near, the fire and the stars and the quiet country, and the good man at peace within it. For beneath all his loneliness and all his sorrow, Arthur had these moments, moments of quiet peace in the beautiful country, moments of rest and contentment, and they are as much a part of him as his grief. He loved the wild country, loved its beauty, took joy in the small wonders of it, and in these quiet moments, alone by his fire under the stars, he found a kind of peace, a rest from his sorrows, a communion with the beautiful world around him. And it is right to remember him this way too, at peace by his fire, and not only in his loneliness and his loss. And as we come to the end of our long, gentle wander through the story of Arthur Morgan and his loneliness, it is worth resting for a moment on why such a sorrowful story should be so soothing a thing to drift towards sleep upon. Part of it surely is the tenderness of it, for beneath all its sorrow, Arthur's story is a story of a gentle heart, of a longing to be good, of a soul that found at the end its grace, and there is something deeply comforting in spending the last hour of the day in the company of such a soul, tender and searching, and at last redeemed. And part of it is the beauty of it, the vast and gorgeous country through which Arthur rides, the fire and the stars and the mountains and the rivers, the great wild beautiful world of his story. For there is a deep peace in that beauty, a soothing quality in the immense and lovely landscape, and it is a gentle thing to drift through as sleep draws near, the beautiful wild country in the last light of the day. Arthur's world is beautiful, for all its sorrow, and its beauty is a comfort. And part of it, perhaps, is the hope at the heart of the sorrow, the hope of redemption, of grace, of a loneliness that heals, of a soul that finds itself at the end. For Arthur's story, though sad, is finally hopeful, finally about grace, and there is a deep comfort in that, in the knowledge that even the loneliest soul can find peace, that even the hardest life can end in grace, that even the deepest loneliness can heal. It is a hopeful sorrow, Arthur's story, and hope is a gentle thing to carry down into sleep. So let all of it settle over you now, softly, the whole gentle, sorrowful story of Arthur Morgan, and let it grow quiet and begin to fade. Let it drift over you one last time, the lonely rider in the great country, the fire burning low under the stars, the journal open in the firelight, the sunrise over the mountains at the end, the good man finding, at the last, his peace. Let the images grow dim and gentle and soft at their edges. No longer quite pictures now, but only a warm, kind, formless drift, slow and easy and safe, dissolving gently into the quiet, into the warmth, into the soft and steady rhythm of your own easy breathing. There is nothing left to carry tonight, no trail to ride and no camp to keep, no debt to pay and no goodbye to say. You have wandered a long way into the story of the lonely rider, into the hard shell and the gentle heart beneath, into his losses and his grief and his grace, and there is nothing more you need to carry now, and nothing at all you must stay awake to hear. It is all told, and you may let it go. Let it all drift over you softly now, the vast quiet country in the last light of the day, the mountains going blue in the distance, the campfire glowing far off in the gathering dark, the lonely rider still upon his horse at the edge of it all. Let the images grow dim and gentle and soft at their edges, the way the world does in the last moments before sleep, until they are no longer quite pictures at all, but only a warm grey drift, kind and formless and slow. None of it is real, and none of it can trouble you. The lonely rider can keep his quiet watch over the vanishing frontier without any help from you tonight, and all his sorrows can rest gently in the dark, where they have rested so long already, and you may set the whole of it softly down and be at peace. There is nothing to carry here, and nothing to fear, and nothing to do but let your body grow heavy, and your thoughts grow soft, and the last of the day drains slowly away. You do not have to carry anything tonight, and you do not have to be strong, and you do not have to hold back a single one of the day's small sorrows. The long day is over now, every last piece of it, and you carried it well, and there is nothing left of it to bear or to mend, only the soft, dark, closing gently around you, kind and safe and yours. Let each slow breath carry you a little further down, past the last of the day's small worries, past the lonely rider and the great dark country and the fire under the stars, down into the quiet, down into the warmth, down toward the deep and easy rest that is waiting for you now. Let the great country grow still and quiet, the fire burning down to embers, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the lonely rider at last at peace beneath them, his long ride over, his sorrows set down, his heart, at the end, at rest. Let the whole vast, beautiful land sink into the deep quiet of the night, and let yourself sink along with it, safe and warm beneath the blankets, breathing slow, the drifting down, letting go. And if it is a comfort, you might carry with you into sleep the gentle thought that even the loneliest heart can find its peace in the end, that even the hardest road can lead, at last, to grace, that the sun always rises, in the end, over the mountains. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry, and nothing at all you must do now but rest. Rest now. You have earned this quiet too. Let the vast far country and its lonely rider fade into the ordinary gentle dark of your own room, soft and kind and yours to sleep in, and there is nothing at all you need to do until morning, but lie still in the warmth and breathe, and drift and rest. Sleep well, and let the gentle dark carry you softly down toward the light of morning. Good night.